and thank you all for joining the lecture. I'm Li Chen, an associate professor of Chinese history and law at the University of Toronto in Canada. Professor Taisu Zhang of Yale Law School and I have organized this year-long international speaker series on rethinking cultural constructions of law in East Asia. And this is the fourth monthly lecture of the series. As many of you know, our first three lectures were quite successful and attracted somewhere between 500 to 900 people on our two platforms. As usual, Taisu and I would like to thank our three co-sponsoring institutions, the University of Toronto, Cornell Law School, and Yale Law School. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Teemu Ruskola. Professor Teemu Ruskola is an endowed chair professor of law at Emory University and also an affiliated faculty member in history, East Asian studies, comparative literature, and women's and gender and sexuality studies. Professor Ruskola is the author of a widely acclaimed monograph entitled Legal Orientalism, China, the United States, and the Modern Law, published by Harvard University Press in 2013. And he is also the co-author of a Schlesinger's Comparative Law and co-editor of a special double issue of a journal Social Text on China and the Human. The title of his lecture today is A Brief History of Inequality and Economic Development in the PRC. We also have two very accomplished scholars as commentators for today's talk. I will ask my co-organizer, Professor Taisu Zhang, to introduce the two commentators. Taisu?
So our first commentator is Professor Odette Lienau, who is Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Intellectual Life at Cornell Law School. Her work focuses on sovereign debt and debtor-creditor relations, international economic law, international relations, and law and political theory. Her first book, Rethinking Sovereign Debt, Politics, Reputation, and Legitimacy in Modern Finance, won a book award from the American Society of International Law, and her current research focuses on the tensions in the international rules associated with private wealth and sovereign borrowing. So our second commentator is Professor Yu Xingzhong, who is the Anthony W. and Lulu C. Wang Professor in Chinese Law at Cornell. His academic interests include social theory, comparative legal philosophy, Chinese law and legal history, constitutional law, new technologies in law, and cultural studies of law. Prior to joining Cornell Law School, he was with the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he taught jurisprudence, constitutional law, and Chinese law. Right, so welcome to both Teemu and both the commentators, and I look forward very much to our session.
Okay, thanks, Taisu. Before we start, I would like to reiterate our practice and format. In terms of the time allocation, our speaker will have 40 to 45 minutes, and each of our commentators will have 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will have about 40 minutes for Q&A. We normally end around 12, but the speaker, if the speaker wants to answer questions, the speaker can extend it for another 10 minutes. Throughout the whole event, we request all in the audience mute themselves and also submit their questions to the chat room. Taisu will help collect the questions. So if there's no other logistic concern, we will invite Teemu to start. Teemu, it's all yours.
Very good. Thank you so much. First of all, thanks for everybody for being here. I know it's a Friday morning during a pandemonium, so maybe we all need a little bit of a distraction. So I'm very excited to be here, and I really want to give a special thank you, obviously, to the organizers, Professors Li Chen and Taisu Zhang, for organizing not just this talk, but this entire series, which I really think is so fantastic and something that the field, I think, really, and judging from the attendance, the field really needs and appreciates. And of course, many thanks also to Marilyn Serna, without whom none of this would be possible, logistically and otherwise. And lastly, just a really big thank you to the two commentators, Professors Odette Lienau and Yu Xingzhong, both of whom are scholars that I greatly admire, and I really think they'll be, they will have insightful thoughts as I work on this project. So let me just get started, because I do want to abide by the time restrictions. If it looks like I'm going to go over, so please do just give me the stop sign, and I will stop. So I'm actually not really a PowerPoint person. Let me see if I can even find my PowerPoint. I have to sort of restart my thing. They say that only people with power use PowerPoint. So I don't have power, but I do have a couple of points that I did wanted to illustrate. So what I will do is I will share my desktop. Oops. Just for 1 minute, and then the rest of the talk I will just talk through it. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, do you see my desktop? Great.
Yes.
So the title of my presentation is A Brief History of Inequality and Economic Development in the PRC. And it grows out of an article that I published last year in the American Journal of Comparative Law, entitled People, Inc., Law, Economic Enterprise, and the Development of Economic Inequality in China. I'm actually in the process of turning this into a larger book project, and the provisional title right now is The Unmaking of the Chinese Working Class, A Brief History of Inequality in the People's Republic of China. Of course, nothing about China is exactly brief, so we'll see how successful I am in keeping this at the length that I want to maintain it, but I'm determined to try, and I'm really looking forward to the feedback today in accomplishing that. So I'll give you a basic outline of my talk just so you can keep track of where I'm going. So after a short introduction, I'm going to talk about economic enterprise, structures of economic enterprise and inequality, first in the countryside under the rubric of Village Inc., then in cities, in urban settings under the rubric People Inc., and I'll conclude by talking about implications for labor relations and domestic relations. I'm also mindful that this forum is, of course, called Rethinking Cultural Constructions of Law in East Asia. So both in my introduction and at the end, I also want to spend something about what, if anything, any of this has to do with culture. But first, I'll just flag two key abbreviations that I'll be using. First, SOEs. So when I talk about urban reforms, I talk about those primarily in terms of state-owned enterprises, which will be familiar to many. But I'll also be talking about TVEs when I talk about rural reforms, which is a less known creature, township and village enterprises, and that were engaged in industrial enterprise specifically. So that's my overall game plan for this talk, and I'm going to stop sharing for a minute at least. And up front, though, I want to actually just emphasize that even though SOEs and TVEs, state-owned enterprises and township and village enterprises, although they were the two paradigmatic forms of public enterprise, rural and urban, they actually almost never analyzed together. Well, of course, there exists a huge divide, administrative and social divide between urban and rural China, which unfortunately is also reflected in many ways in academically as well. So the scholars usually study either urban or rural institutions. Default tends to be to study urban China, even though the bulk of the population lives outside cities. But my premise is that you really can't understand changing structures of inequality in China unless you consider city and country dynamically in relation to one another. And I'll also note, just by way of background, that this project is, in a sense, an intellectual homecoming of sorts. It goes back to an article I wrote way back in year 2000. It's one of these mammoth 130+ page law review articles that I published in the Stanford Law Review. And that piece was called Conceptualizing Corporations and Kinship. And Max Weber, as many of you will know, has argued that one key reason why capitalism failed, his word, failed to develop in China was the absence of the idea of the corporation as a legal person. Since, he argued, because most family businesses were, Chinese businesses were family businesses, then they broke up every few generations, unlike a legal person who is immortal, potentially. Well, my counter argument was that historically, in lots of Chinese family businesses, the notion of kinship was in fact a genealogical and legal fiction that justified the existence of what I refer to as clan corporations. Much as the notion of personhood in Euro-American corporation law is also a legal fiction that allows corporations to exist over time. And as a corollary, I argued that therefore in late imperial China, Confucian family law effectively performed many of the key functions of corporation law. So looking back, I realized that article sought to map out the boundary between the market and the family in late imperial China. In this more recent piece that I just referred to, I focus on the boundary between the market and the state. What is the difference between the government and the corporation in China today? And more expansively, how do the market and the state relate to the family? That brief introduction, let me turn to TVs. So when people think of China's rise, they probably think of all these megacities symbolized above all by the futuristic skyline of Shanghai. However, it's important to keep in mind when the reforms began in 1978, they started in the countryside. In fact, the area across the Huangpu River that is now filled with skyscrapers was essentially rice fields through the 80s. So I want to talk about first, how is it that a program of agricultural reforms first turned into a huge success story of rural industrialization? That was not the original goal. Second, how and why was it that this booming rural industry ultimately came to be taken over by urban industry? So to frame my analysis, just a couple of facts about the political economy of the Maoist period. The PRC was formally established in 1949, and of course, one of the first tasks was land reform. By 1958, agriculture had been collectivized, which meant to say that it was rural land, countryside was divided into communes, which were expected to be self-dependent and responsible for their own welfare needs. This meant that in times of need, for example, they could be subject to famine, ultimately, without intervention from central government. In contrast, the urban economy was founded around newly established SOEs, state-owned enterprises, which were built around heavy machinery designed to help China compete in the Cold War. Unlike peasants, SOE workers in cities enjoyed cradle-to-grave welfare, funded precisely by extracting resources from the already poor countryside to help in this Cold War competition. And SOEs provided lifetime job security, as well as housing, kindergartens, schools, hospitals, retirement benefits, which was all part of the so-called Iron Rice Bowl. Well, these two economically unequal classes of citizens were kept apart by means of the so-called hukou system or household registration system, which was a system that tied key benefits to a person's residence. And these benefits ranged from housing to schooling to food rations. So it's important to keep in mind then that when the reforms began in 1978, the main priority was reducing rural poverty. The famous communique of the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, issued in December 78, is often viewed as a kind of official declaration of the reform era. And that communique announced that a class struggle had been won in China in the main. And ideologically, this provided a justification for focusing on economic development rather than continuing to seek out class enemies. And the very first reform was the de-collectivization of agriculture. Communes were allowed to lease to their members. And in fact, agricultural increased quickly. But there was a downside. Because of these mobility controls, more efficient farming resulted in massive rural unemployment. On the upside though, now that peasants were increasingly allowed to sell what they produced on the market, there were new savings that became a new source of capital. That capital could be invested in rural industry, which could then absorb the surplus labor from agriculture. And that is in fact pretty much what happened. And it is really important, although increasingly difficult to remember, the main engine of China's phenomenal growth through the mid-90s was rural industry. The vast bulk of that industry was organized in the form of collective enterprises known as township and village enterprises, which seems counterintuitive. If the success of agriculture resulted from its de-collectivization, why was industrial capital organized in the form of collectives rather than, for instance, private enterprise? The story is complicated, but it starts with the fiscal restructuring of the state. So constitutionally, China is a kind of unitary centralized hierarchy of 5 levels of government. Historically, the central government collected all the taxes and then allocated the money downward according to need. And colloquially, the system was known as 吃大锅饭, eating from one big pot. Well, in 1980, there was a reform that made each level responsible for collecting its own taxes. So they had a quota, they had to pass up the food chain, but otherwise they were on their own. This became known as a 分灶吃饭, eating in separate kitchens. The main motivation was that the center would no longer have to make up the deficits at local level. But on the flip side, again, it meant those local governments could keep any funds that they collected above their tax quota. So this, in fact, gave the local governments a new incentive to invest in business undertakings. They would get to keep the profits they would generate, which was then the birth of TVEs. It turns out these TVEs were enormously successful. I'm going to cite just one statistics. I have scores of them in my paper, in my article. But in 15 years, TVE's share of the total industrial output in China went from 9% to 36% at a time when China's GDP itself was exploding at a world historic rate. So far so good. But at this point, you may be asking, sure, what does any of that have to do with law? Well, as far as existing legal scholarship is concerned, not a whole lot. Lawyers have basically ignored TVEs since they were essentially an extra-legal phenomenon. It was only in 1997 that China finally enacted a formal TVE law, which paradoxically coincided with TVE's economic decline. They were already on their way out. Well, in my opinion, the ostensibly extra-legal nature of TVEs is not a reason for legal scholars to ignore them. On the contrary, it's a reason for us to be especially interested. There's a puzzle there. How did they work? However, in contrast to law, there is actually a considerable literature on TVEs, both in economics and political science. So first, economics. How is it possible, economists ask, that these TVEs were able to succeed even in the absence of property rights, which defies basic economic theory? Before I talk about the internal functioning of TVEs, let me note that there is actually some debate as to whether these TVEs were real collectives or whether they were just private enterprises that were masquerading and passing themselves off as public. There's no question there existed a range of different types of TVEs on the public-private spectrum, but it's pretty clear that most TVEs, certainly most of the largest and most successful ones, were genuinely collectively owned enterprises, which probably should not surprise us, either theoretically or historically. Consider the theory of the firm in institutional economics. So for an institutional economist, a firm is a kind of vertical command hierarchy that exists in the middle of markets that are otherwise organized horizontally. And a firm arises when so the theory goes, a firm arises when transaction costs for coordinating economic activity through simple contracts are too high. So instead of, when it's no longer possible for you to outsource all of your inputs, you hire people who work directly under you. From that perspective, the firm is in fact a kind of small scale planned economy in the middle of otherwise freewheeling markets. Now, switching from theory to history. Well, in 1978, in most places, the local state was pretty much the only structure of authority left standing after the Cultural Revolution. So emerging rural enterprise had very little choice but to take on the institutional form of the state. There was very little else there that they could choose from. And this is then where the political scientists come in as well. So some political scientists have described TVEs as an instance of what they call local state corporatism. I use the shorthand term Village Inc. And by this, I mean it's the villagers who are in fact the real owners of these TVEs. Of course, they don't have formal rights in those TVEs, but their interests are represented by local officials who are sort of the de facto equivalent of a board of directors. Their task is to monitor the TVE managers on the villagers' behalf. And what's more interesting, most TVEs, they did reinvest the bulk of their surpluses, and then they redistributed the rest to the villagers as kind of quasi-dividends. So the typical TV, in fact, provided all kinds of public goods. It could be community centers, educational subsidies, clinics, some TVEs, even free water and electricity. But we are still left with a puzzle. In theory, no investor, whether public or private, should be willing to invest in an enterprise without secure property rights. So it is here that the economists and not lawyers actually ask the legal question. And let me turn to Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel laureate as well as the former chief economist of the World Bank. Many economists are quite dismissive of TVEs. They see them as some kind of perverse hybrid of public and private. Well, Stiglitz interestingly argues that they worked precisely because they combine political and economic structures. So he argues that in the absence of formal property rights, village governments were able to protect TV assets politically, which is a very useful observation as far as it goes, but it actually doesn't go nearly far enough. Sure, these village officials, they were able to use, in fact, their political power to monitor managers in these enterprises. But how did the villagers in turn then oversee the officials to make sure that the officials too acted in the collective interest? So what kept the officials from pocketing the proceeds for themselves? And this is, in effect, sort of the TVE version of what US corporate lawyers call agency problem, which is a huge problem also in US public corporations. How do we make sure that shareholders, how do shareholders in general make sure that officers manage the corporation in the shareholders' benefit and not in their own benefit? So in other words, TVEs, whatever problems TVEs had, their problems were much bigger than lacking formal property rights. They also did not have the benefit of any kind of organizational law. So my argument here is that in TVEs, it was local government law that performed the core functions of corporation law. So you have kind of village law as corporation law. And here I'm obviously using the terms very broadly, meaning to capture by the term law both formal and informal institutions of village governance. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. If you're interested, the article version has lots more. So in terms of formal law, of course, village elections are the most obvious, although not necessarily perhaps the most effective institution of village governance. But there are lots of instances where villagers have been able to use elections successfully to police TVEs. They've been able to overturn manipulated votes. They've been able to reclaim diverted funds, audit suspicious accounts, and so on and so forth. So it's not negligible. More importantly, even when formal rights go unenforced, villagers are actually increasingly often aware of them and then take action on their own, staging collective protests. So we could think of these collective protests as kind of informal class actions, shareholder revolts, more or less literally. So in addition, TVEs have drawn on the reemergence of traditional notions of kinship. Of course, in 1949, the party condemned Confucianism as a feudal superstition. And with collectivization, a typical village that was nominated by a single kinship group would have been turned into a commune. But in practice, often what happened was a kind of relabeling of Confucian class-based entities into socialist ones. So it's no surprise that when communes were being reconverted back into villages after 78, in lots of places, clan organizations re-emerge as the strongest non-market institution around. So when I argued some 20 years ago that Confucian kinship norms function as corporation law, I thought I was making an essentially historical and theoretical argument, but it turns out that these kinship institutions have continued to structure economic enterprise under socialism as well. For example, it turns out single surname villages that have re-established their lineage organizations have an exceptional record of successful TVEs. They also tend to supply public goods to their communities at very high levels. So let me catch my breath here, though. Literally and figuratively. So I don't mean to idealize TVEs. There's a large literature in China, mostly by new left critics, that tends to romanticize these TVEs as sort of the last best hope of Chinese socialism in the early reform era. Well, the key point that I want to make is simply that they worked, and they worked for a they worked very well for a considerable period of time. That said, though, today they are basically, basically history. And for many scholars, especially for economists, this then proves that they were ultimately only a transitional form and that they were destined to fade away over time. To me, that is an ahistorical conclusion. One really important reason for the eclipse was a series of political decisions made by the central state. So even as the TVEs were booming through the 80s, early 90s, SOEs in the cities continued to bleed money. In 1994, the state reversed its earlier fiscal reforms. They basically increased local government's tax quotas, which put a squeeze on the TVEs. And right when the TVEs needed money the most, the state began to redirect rural capital into cities to help revive SOEs. And in fact, the first formal company law of the PRC came into force that very same year, 1994, to help harness capital, for SOEs, for their reform. All of this was also part of a larger, you might call it, constitutional moment. There was growing concern about conformity with Marxist, Leninist, Maoist thought. So in 1993, the party wrote into the Constitution a new ideological template. The notion of a socialist market economy was codified in Article 15. To be sure, nobody knew exactly what socialist market economy means. Sounds sort of like squaring the circle, you might think, but that, of course, was precisely the beauty and utility of it. Next, I'm going to turn now to SOEs, but let me pause and just recap a couple of key points about TVEs. So first of all, they challenged the dominant narrative that would ascribe, or at least a dominant narrative, that would ascribe China's success to the rise of the markets, the retreat of the states. Until the mid-90s, the country's stunning economic growth was driven by TVEs, which were a hugely successful form of local public enterprise. Second, the TVEs also challenge a standard positivist account of corporation law in China. So rather than beginning the story with the formal enactment of the Company Law 1994, written for SOEs, we actually discover a kind of corporation law emerging in the Chinese countryside over a decade earlier with the TVEs. Thirdly, the proliferation and success of TVEs achieved precisely what the reformers had hoped to achieve. They helped reduce the historic welfare gap between the city and the country, which is crucial because from here on in, economic reforms start to become an engine of growing inequality. They usher in a new regime of technocratic state capitalism premised on urban development, which is the China we know today, at least from Western media. All these megacities with dazzling skylines, which are funded by global capital and built by armies of migrant labor from the countryside. So let me then switch to SOEs with that segue. SOEs are indeed much better known than TVEs. They're common to pretty much all socialist economies. I already talked about them a little bit, so I will be brief. Historically, Chinese SOEs came in many varieties. Some were operated by central ministries, but others were run by provincial and municipal governments at lower levels. Ultimately, though, they were all subject to the central government. In principle, they were owned by the people as a whole and operated by the state on the people's behalf. In other words, SOEs had exactly the same kind of separation between ownership and management as TVEs. The people were the owners, the state functioned as a kind of board of directors who would oversee the enterprise on the people's behalf. However, from a comparative perspective, SOEs are a form of public enterprise that has been much less successful as a group, as a whole, than TVEs. Why would the central state have more difficulty monitoring its enterprises than townships and villages? The central state is more powerful. Size of the entities being monitored might be part of the explanation, but it's not the whole story. SOEs on average may be bigger, but they vary enormously in size, just like TVEs. And in fact, many of the most successful TVEs were among the largest and far bigger than many SOEs. So ultimately, SOE's problem was not or is not the lack of proper monitoring. On the contrary, the state has had a lot, too much control. And because of the specific bureaucratic structure of the Chinese state, a single SOE is typically subject to supervision by multiple agencies, often with divergent interests. This phenomenon is often colloquially referred to as having too many mothers-in-law. And from the cultural construction side, that's obviously a sexist and problematic metaphor, but I'll leave that for our discussion later. In my article version, which will be the first part of the book, I review in detail a range of early reform measures to try to fix the SOEs. But long story short, they all culminate in the enactment of the first ever company law, enacted the very same year when the socialist market economy was constitutionalized. And it marked, as I suggested, a shift away from rural development to massive state-led urban industrialization. And it's really important to emphasize that the goal of the company law was not to privatize SOEs. The point was to corporatize them, or 公司化, as the Chinese term, very deliberate Chinese term goes, which is to say, the law was not intended to abolish the Marxian principle of public ownership of means of production. It was only meant to change the legal form that public ownership takes. So converting SOEs into the form of the corporation would then allow the state to attract, yes, much needed outside capital, but the state would remain the controlling shareholder. And it's this reorganization that I characterize as People Inc., sort of analogous to Village Inc. To be sure, a lot of Western commentators were not impressed by the new law. It was described as being too restrictive. They said it was a misunderstanding, quote unquote, corporation law. I would say to call it a misunderstanding is itself a misunderstanding of the purpose of the law. It was not intended primarily as a vehicle for private enterprise, but as a tool for regulating SOEs, corporatized SOEs. So we've already seen that in TVEs, the law of local government functioned as a kind of corporation law. Here there's sort of a reversal. In SOEs, corporation law functions as a kind of administrative law, a means by which the state regulates components of itself. In any event, since 1994, corporatized SOEs have had the benefit of a formal law that regulates them, which is something, as I suggested, that TVEs lacked. Paradoxically, the TVEs yet have outperformed SOEs. That would seem especially strange because a lot of the company law, many of the provisions can be seen as a formal enactment of structures that were already pioneered by TVEs. So for one thing, clearly formal law alone is not enough. And as I've suggested, the TVEs enjoyed the benefit of various informal institutions of accountability as well. Whereas it seems SOEs have suffered from the lack of the same type of local customary law to regulate them, regulate them internally. To be sure, it's crucial to emphasize that at the same time, some corporatized SOEs have done enormously well, most notably the so-called national champions, which control huge chunks of the Chinese economy. But I think that their success is best explained by their political connections, right? Rather than the legal structures, governance structures that support them, namely political access to capital. Under Chinese state capitalism, all successful large firms, whether public or private, rely on connections to state power. So let me now switch gears again and turn to some of the implications of all these issues for questions of equality. So yes, the corporatization of SOEs changed primarily the form in which state exercises its control over capital, as an investor rather than a direct owner. In contrast, SOE corporatization has utterly revolutionized the state's relationship to labor, even though most studies of SOE reform essentially ignore that aspect. And here I think we have another academic division of labor that gets in the way of analysis. So the study of the organization of capital belongs to the purview of scholars who study corporation law and securities law. The study of the organization of labor, in contrast, then is the province of employment and labor law. But it is just not possible to understand the full significance of SOE reform without considering both capital and labor in relation to one another. So we saw that a classic SOE took care of its workers from birth to death. The work unit combined, we could say, the functions of the state, the enterprise, and the family. However, when an SOE is reimagined as a business corporation, even a state-controlled business corporation, the workplace becomes just that, the place for work. So simultaneously with the company law, there was a new labor law. This was not a coincidence. And that labor law required for the first time that all employees must be put on contracts. This marked the official end of the iron rice bowl and lifetime job security. So moving from status to contract, as Henry Maine would have it, labor was commodified in essentially one generation, which is a truly stupendous transformation. With the introduction of wage labor, the meaning of work, even the meaning of what it means to be a working being, changed fundamentally. So we already saw the company law, in effect, sought to reconstitute SOEs as formally autonomous market actors. The institution of the employment contract does the same on the level of the individual. Effectively, it undoes the people in the People Inc. Under Maoism, workers in the SOEs were officially viewed as masters of the enterprise. Of course, they were politically subordinated, but that was their official status. When SOE workers are put on contracts, the ideological unity of capital and labor is broken. The people are atomized into independent economic subjects, subjects who consent to the conditions of their labor and they remain responsible for their own welfare outside of work. And that is precisely why the full story of the Chinese company law and the corporatization of SOEs goes far beyond SOEs themselves and has implications for equality and for society as a whole. So in effect, this restructuring, SOE restructuring has resulted in tectonic shifts in the boundaries between the state, the market, and the family. The state subsequently has had to find new ways to deliver benefits that were formerly channeled through SOEs. And there are indeed basically three alternatives. They can be provided by the state directly, like much of education. They can be provided by creating new markets, like for markets for private housing, or they can be delegated to the family, like much of childcare and welfare, elder care. Let me start with the family. So the state has indeed increasingly turned to the family as a way to privatize the state's welfare obligations that were once borne by SOEs. For example, the marriage law was amended in 2003, and it made family members responsible for kinfolk and even non-kin who are unable to support themselves. Similarly, the inheritance law prohibits, even though it provides for a testamentary freedom, it nevertheless prohibits testators from disinheriting poor family members, as well as other needy dependents, whether family or not. Indeed, paradoxically, the very same reforms that are causing the state to turn to the family in order to sort of pick up the slack, these same reforms are now undermining the traditional family that is supposed to perform those earlier functions. Historically, the traditional family was primarily a kind of vertical intergenerational unit based on the father-son connection. That's the Confucian view. And it was also, therefore, a kind of corporate entity that was expected to take care of an extended membership generationally and otherwise. Today, marriage is viewed primarily as a horizontal partnership between husband and wife, premised on the gratification of personal desire. This connection is much less enduring, and it is reflected in rising rates of divorce. And it has also altered the social contract between parents and children. Yes, the one-child policy has been relaxed, admittedly, as it has become apparent that a generation of only children will not be prepared to support their aging parents, either materially or psychologically. So with that, let me then return to frame this in terms of the larger questions of inequality. So I began the story with a state-enforced economic inequality between the city and the country. Today, there are, in fact, newly markets for labor and for housing, which means peasants are no longer tied to the soil. Instead, they have become an endless army of migrant labor in the cities. At the same time, with the contractualization of all labor, even urban citizens no longer enjoy a guaranteed share of the benefits of economic development as they once did. They too are being left behind. So as a result, this earlier legally enforced urban-rural inequality is being overwhelmed increasingly with a simple distinction between the rich and the poor that is spreading society-wide without a necessary geographical correlate. And ultimately, there is a larger irony to all of this. As I suggested, the ideological justification for the earlier reforms was the party's announcement that class struggle was over, it was time to move on to economic development. In other words, it was the formal abolition of class struggle that led to the massively stratified economy that we have today. But precisely because class, the term class, has been retired from the party lexicon, there is really no adequate political vocabulary to describe the problems that we face today. So where does this leave us? Let me conclude with a brief methodological note. Probably the two most common words used to describe China's transformation, ongoing transformation, are one, reform, two, transition. They sound like they're descriptive, but in fact, both terms are deeply ideological. So first, the so-called reform era started in 1978. My math not so good, but I figured it's been going on for over 40 years, more than a decade longer than the so-called non-reform era before 1978. So it's an extremely anemic term that is profoundly inadequate to describe the revolution that has been taking place in China. What it does do, though, is it depoliticizes that revolution, as if all we're talking about is some technocratic adjustments in the name of economic development. The term transition is related. It suggests that these so-called reforms are headed towards some known destination. Usually, people impliedly or explicitly view that destination as some kind of idealized liberal capitalist system based on a more or less Western model. Unless and until China reaches that ultimate telos, however defined, its institutions remain transitional, by implication somehow inauthentic. That, of course, is bunk. Everything in the world is changing all the time, in China as well as in the so-called West. So I will just conclude, at least for now, by observing that if nothing else, a comparative analysis shows that political, social, economic institutions can be combined and recombined in numerous ways to serve numerous different purposes. There is no theory that will tell us what is the right way to combine them. That is a political and ethical decision that can and must be made only by historical actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teemu. Perfect timing. Now we will invite our two commentators share their thoughts. Odette?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Teemu, for a great talk and a really interesting paper. And I look forward to the forthcoming book, which sounds incredibly timely and important. And also, of course, to Lee and Taisu for inviting me to join this speaker series. It's been just a great program that you've put together. I'm incredibly impressed. And also all the attendees, both in the Zoom format and in the other formats, for joining today. Especially because I know that we're spread across multiple time zones, so some of you are spending your Friday evening looking at this. So I'm especially impressed with that. This is far from my area in terms of kind of thinking about developments in China specifically. So some of my comments are going to be kind of more comparative, kind of international relations elements in nature. But I found this very, very interesting. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of global trends, kind of general historical trends, ask a couple questions about SOEs and TBEs in particular, and then ask you, though I know you'll probably be reluctant to do so, to project forward and to give your advice, even though I know you just finished by saying that no one can make these decisions or recommendations aside from the people on the ground. Nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of that. So first, on the issues of global trends versus endogenous sort of China-specific trends. I was kind of curious about that. One, especially kind of as you're thinking about the book in general and kind of projecting about inequality in China, it seems that some of the issues, the themes that you talked about are not necessarily China-specific, right? I mean, there's a whole global range of things that are echoing what you discuss in the China context. And this is, of course, resultant from kind of the increase of global capital, the lowering of capital controls, and a range of kind of sort of financial measures along those lines. Now, those are in some ways less present in China than in some other countries, just because of the nature of the international financial controls. But nonetheless, there's all these global economic trends that are impacting the rise of inequality. And so I'm wondering, especially if you are not making a kind of a traditional social scientific causal argument, at least that's not how I understand your argument is developing, it is nonetheless hinting in that direction. And so I wonder if you could tease out a little bit more how you see these two things working together. It seems like that will be a useful thing for you to do as you go forward and think about the book a little bit more thoroughly. So that's one thing, thinking about exogenous as opposed to endogenous trends and how you see them as interacting in the rise of inequality. Second, thinking about kind of larger global and also historical trends. I thought the discussion of the shift from status to contract was very interesting, and the increase of atomization and contractualization was very interesting. And I again wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the degree to which you think that this is a Chinese manifestation of a broader, not inevitable, but definitely shared theme. I mean, going back to, of course, Marx, and this is a very dusty capital version of Capital I have on my shelves, but Marx talking about the shift from the traditional kind of master-servant status relationship into contract in the kind of early European developments, and how that translates to what is now happening in China. How distinct is it, or is it just a sort of a different historical and geographical manifestation of something that's a larger trend? So I was kind of curious about that. Kind of related to this shift in atomization and this shift to contractualization, one of the things that's been identified, at least in sometimes in the US context and European context, is the change in the incentives and interest of labor, who now can be understood to some degree as more akin to arguably having a stake in capital as opposed to in opposition to capital, right? And of course, that depends on the nature of the ways in which particular employees are tied into the interests of the entities that they're working for. Right, I mean, to what degree are they still considered stakeholders in a kind of a more capitalist system as opposed to not? But there is that discussion in the US and European context, and I wonder if you see any of that change in the interest and incentive structure of labor in the shift that you're seeing there, and that sort of shift from status to contract, right? I was curious about that, because that is sometimes presented as helping to deal with the inequality that arises from this shift from status to contract, because now the contract is tying you into this alternative version, so it's all going to end up okay in the end, right? So you sometimes will hear that version in this context. So I was kind of curious about that as well. So that's one set of questions that I had that I would be interested in hearing your views about. Another set of questions or comments I had was more specifically about SOEs and TBEs, which was very interesting to me. As you point out, especially in the legal literature, there's a lot of discussion about SOEs, much less about TBEs. And so reading about TBEs was kind of a new thing for me. So I thought that was very interesting. I'm going to start with a question about SOEs, sort of especially the people inquiry organization version. That I'm not sure I agree with this question, but nonetheless, some people might have it, so I'll throw it out there. And especially in terms of your presentation of the SOEs is not quite as successful. And part of it is, I'll also use a genderedly problematic term, too many mother-in-laws. To what degree is this problem of the government presence in the SOEs a sort of a China-specific problem, or is it a question of a degree or a problem of degree with the general discussion that's certainly present in the US about, government over interfering in enterprise, right? Is it part of a general problem of government over interfering in enterprise, government over regulation of enterprise, or is it a more specific thing that you could not generalize from, right? Because you can imagine some range of people looking at this and say, aha, see, this is just an example of this broader theme that I've been harping on for the last, let's say, 30 years in certain fields of law and economics, right? So I wonder if you could tease that out a little bit. And then on the TBE issue, I thought that was very interesting, sort of thinking about local government and local governance as a form of corporate or business organization. And here I was wondering, and I don't know if you're familiar with some of this literature, some of the work on early corporate forms in the European context that's been done by, for example, David Cipollone, who is he's a fantastic kind of political theorist, and he's done some work on early corporate formations, and including actually corporate formations in the Western religious tradition, but thinking of governmental forms is actually the basis for certain types of corporate forms. So I don't, if you're familiar with that, I would be interested in hearing about, the degree to which you think that's comparative, or if there's connection. And if you are not familiar with that, I think you might be interested. So you might want to take a look. I'm trying to be mindful of not going over my time. So my final sort of set of questions and comments was about kind of projecting forward. And I know you're very careful about saying, look, I'm not doing a romance of the TBE, and there's a sort of like left critics in China that are that are a little too nostalgic, right? And so I understand that that's true, and I am sympathetic to not looking backward necessarily to project forward. Nonetheless, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what plausibly could be learned from that previous experience. And I mean, on the one hand, you want to be cautious because the massive success of the TVEs, and this is a little bit of a sub-question here, maybe depends on the baseline that you're looking at. Maybe the baseline of underdevelopment was so severe that really any vaguely competent form of organization could have been successful, right? As opposed to this particular form, right? So part of it is, what is your imagined historical control group for the TBE, right? I mean, of course, you can't run an experiment, but you know, if you can think about kind of hypotheticals, what was it? Was it something specifically about the TBE as opposed to just the baseline was so low that anything would have succeeded? And I think that connects to my general question of, are there any elements of that form that might help us think into the future, or is that truly, as you say, very much in history? And part of the reason I'm asking is I'm asking for China, right? Because of course this is an indigenous Chinese form, and so it's kind of interesting to think about, could this solve some of the problems that are present today? But there's all this interest in, you know, to what degree can we borrow, and we want to be careful about legal transplants and so on and so forth, right? But are any of these hybridized forms or earlier forms that seem to have been successful in certain areas, could those be translated into other arenas, other countries, or not, right? Especially as China is moving or has moved globally in terms of its international economic presence, right? Now, of course, the nature of its international economic presence overseas has been very much, it seems, from the top, right? Rather than these sort of more local enterprises, but nonetheless, maybe there's something that could be useful. You know, even if it's no longer relevant for the Chinese context, which is one question, could it be relevant for other contexts? And you know, I also am interested in asking about, I mean, at the end you say, at the end of your talk, and you hinted this in the paper as well, that we have the situation where the family has been deconstructed and now it has these additional responsibilities that it doesn't seem capable of actually, you know, maintaining. So is this a sort of a universalist teleological approach to European style social welfare democracy everywhere in the world? I mean, is that the answer? Or is there something that is more appropriate for the Chinese context? And I'm going to ask you that question, even though I know you said that you you didn't want to address that. Nonetheless, the question is so pressing and so globally present that to not use the Chinese example as a way to try to think about some of these issues that are being addressed in multiple countries seems frankly irresponsible. So so I'm kind of curious about that. And then just the very end, you mentioned this sort of language of reform and transition as being evocative of progress towards some eventually not utopian, but definitely better outcome. But you know, reform and transition has been going on for decades at this point. And so what does it mean? And this seemed very much to link to some of the themes in, I don't know if you're familiar with this this literature in political science, but Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way were central in developing on this sort of similar themes, where this language of transition, especially in post-authoritarian regimes where there is this, well, we're in a hybrid situation, it's competitive authoritarianism, and this language of transition is basically putting everyone off, when in fact this is where we are now, and there's no actual change that's likely to happen. So anyway, so it was an incredibly rich paper, incredibly rich talk, and I just, as you can see, generated a range of questions along a range of different issue areas. So thank you very much again.
So thank you, Odette. Professor Yu, floors are yours.
Okay, thank you, Tesu. Thank you very much, Professor Ruskola, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I totally agree with the comments made by my fine colleague, Odette, and I look forward to hearing your answers to her questions. Hi, everyone. Now, inequality is a very broad conceptual category, and it could be addressed from many different perspectives, like political, social, and economic perspectives. We could also look at this from a cultural or religious perspectives. Okay. Now, Professor Ruskola's talk today provides us with a fascinating exploration of PRC histories, inequality problems from an economic and political perspective. His talk examines what happened in the PRC reform era, probably during 1980s and 1990s, economic reforms, development of law, and so on, by focusing on what he called village Inc., TVEs, the townships, village enterprises. He used the urban-rural dual structure as the primary research prism. He's of the view that basically these are two different places, rural area and urban area. These are basically two different Chinas, in fact. But that, of course, is not an exaggeration. In fact, we could see that that distinction still exists in China. In his talk, actually, he mentioned a lot of Chinese laws. In constructing his legal analysis, he talked about the PRC constitution, the corporate law, and labor contract law, in marriage law, etc. So this is really a wonderful piece, wonderful talk that has provided us a lot of intellectual resource, intellectual food. I guess we need to digest later. One of his arguments is that TVEs developed essentially without a formal legal framework. I can't agree with him more. During the last 40 years of economic and social reforms, the Chinese government has paid increasing attention to the use of law because it has been persuaded that the law and the clear definition of property rights, as Douglas North argued, are indispensable in a market economy. But in reality, however, the recent Chinese experience with the economic reforms and legal development challenges rather than proves the correctness of that view. I guess that point is made very clear in Professor Ruskola's talk. In other words, law did not play an important role in China's economic reform, at least not one as important as some scholars and officials believed. It's well known that many innovations and changes that defined the direction of economic reforms emerged among the Chinese people in local communities, villages, and townships. After years of experiments, new ideas and innovations finally received approval from the government. The government then made policies to spread the new practices nationwide and found a proper time to make laws to legitimize the policies. However, the enforcement of these laws was not always successful. When facing new situations, new challenges, the government would design new policies and make amendments to the existing laws. That is basically the pattern of Chinese legal development. First start practice in reality and then use policy to spread it, and then gradually making temporary laws and then more or less fixed laws. Therefore, it was not the policy, but not the law that functioned in this process. A process which, however, was natural, I guess, as Odette already mentioned, for a society in transformation, because policies are more flexible than laws when responding to rapid changes from day to day. So I think that point, I totally agree with Professor Ruskola. But here I would like to offer a couple of comments to appreciate further the importance of this topic and Professor Ruskola's talk. As my interest is in ideas and theories, I would like to understand the inequality issue in terms of cultural attitudes and values. So my argument is basically, I actually don't have any questions. One big question I have would be whether it would be good to put this thesis, inequality thesis, into the larger context of Chinese history, including the traditional Chinese, imperial Chinese China, and also the PRC, early years of the PRC. So in examining the PRC history or any topic, in fact, including inequality and others, one needs to consider three sources. The first is the traditional culture of imperial China. The second is the Marxist or communist ideology and practice in the early years of the PRC. And the third is the reforms that introduced Western institutions and market economy. These are three primary sources that help to shape the current Chinese reality. They also were the critical components of historical development. So I think these three major things very important for us to understand if we want to understand the inequality problem issue in the context of China's history and so on. So let me just first elaborate on these three aspects. I will try to keep my time here. First, inequality is a severe problem in imperial China. It has a long history, in fact. In ancient China, there was no transcendental world that could serve as an ideal and a critique of the human world. Pragmatic legalists such as Shangya and Han Fei, whose ideas and doctrines dominated Chinese history, promoted hierarchical existence among the subjects. Even Confucian idealists promoted hierarchical existence, even though Professor He Huihong of Beijing University views that hierarchy as an open hierarchy. That is, it also allows ordinary people to be successful in their pursuit of their careers. But not infrequently, China in old times tried to classify people into different categories. That, I guess, is one way to illustrate how serious the problem of inequality is in the Chinese history. I don't know, for instance, there's one, this classification, it says, 圣贤智才能平庸愚顽劣. The sage, the wise, the intelligent, the talented, the ordinary, the mediocre, the foolish, the stubborn, and the bad. And even in Yuan dynasty, people were classified into 10 classes. The first being officials, the second, those who serve the officials, and the third, the monks, fourth, Taoists, fifth, medicine practitioners, and the sixth, artisans, seventh, craftsmen, eighth, women who live on immoral earnings, and ninth, notice ninth, number 9 is Confucian scholars, generally intellectuals, right? And 10th, beggars. This was in Yuan dynasty, so they have all this kind of classification of people. So hierarchical existence and different classification. People have been classified into different categories, classes. So inequality exists among the people. It was a kind of accepted fact that existed for a long time, of course. Even though the word equality actually was introduced into the Chinese language a very long time ago. It was in Jin dynasty. The idea of Buddhist idea of equality among all lives, 众生平等, was actually much earlier used in a Chinese context than in the West. In English, the word equality first appeared in the 15th century. Okay, that was much later. Because Chinese history is mainly concerned with the maintenance of the order, and order presupposes a hierarchy. Equality was not a major conceptual category in Chinese cultural history. Okay. The second point I want to make is that the inequality in the early years of the PRC was also very obvious. Even though the PRC began with the Marxist notion of the emancipation of humankind, which advocates equality among all people. And in the first several years of the PRC, political campaigns were introduced by the government aimed at emancipation and equality. Even in the army, equality between officers and soldiers was promoted. And the propaganda promised that everybody would be equal eventually. However, the traditional way of consciousness of inequality survived and was adopted by the PRC government. The inequality began with the government's leaders' privileges and the distinction between cadres and the broad masses, the vanguard, the masses, the rear guards, the leading and the led. Somebody must lead as the others will follow. So government leaders, cadres in all provinces and districts, even counties, were given special treatment according to their relevant importance in the state apparatus. The special treatment included monetary subsidiary, better healthcare, equality food, and local produce. And that special treatment still goes on today, in fact. So it is probably not exaggerating to describe what was going on at that time as a hierarchical egalitarianism. There was an egalitarianism. Everybody was required to be poor, to be equal, even though probably equally poor, not equally wealthy. Yet there was a hierarchy there. Okay, some people actually enjoyed more equality than others. And of course, things were getting worse. I guess those who are familiar with the recent PRC history would have noticed that Chairman Mao in 1957 published his article on correctly handling the contradictions among the people, in which he advocated distinguishing people between people and the enemies. Then the Chinese citizens were basically divided into many different types of categories. Even during the Cultural Revolution, which is the most radical period to break away from tradition in PRC history, traditional notions of differences among and between people became revived again. As I mentioned previously, the traditional classification of people by 9 categories became very popular again. The new categories included Ji, Fu, Fan, Hui, Yu, etc. Landlord, rich people, and counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, and the rightists, and so on. So, and furthermore, the intellectuals who used to be ranked number 9 in Yuan Dynasty were given an even more derogatory name by Chairman Mao, Chu Laojiu, the stinking ninth. Okay. So that was what happened during the early years of the PRC. And now the third point I want to make is that actually during the reform era, there's a stratification of citizenship among the Chinese people. The rural and urban divide is very serious, is very clear there. I guess Professor Ruskola's work is very important in that regard in looking at examining the inequality issues in the PRC, especially during the early part of the reform era. But despite the change of the government's attitudes toward the economic development, law, and in many other aspects, people actually after reform became to be more stratified. In fact, I remember I actually presented a paper a long time ago at a conference organized by Professor Alford at Harvard and Professor Merle Goldman, which presented papers about the Chinese citizenship in the PRC. It was actually talked about this classification of stratification of different citizens in the PRC. And there are privileged citizens, and there are also those underworld citizens, and humiliated citizens, oppressed citizens, alienated citizens, and protected citizens, partial citizens, unwanted citizens, and bargaining chip citizens. I had a classification there, basically talking about all this inequality, among the people there. Just want to briefly talk about this privileged citizens, talking about inequality, right? So privileged citizens are those who not only enjoy rights prescribed and allowed by law and policy, but also very special treatment beyond the scope of rights prescribed by law and policy. Privileged citizens exist in every society, but the Chinese case stands out sharply. Exemplary privileged citizens in China include the politically privileged, like the party members, have access to the knowledge and practice of the working of the inner circles of political power. The economically privileged, who by law or by other means through a relational network, have access to and can deploy the economic resources of the country, administered in the name of the state and the people. And also the geographically privileged who happen to be residents of special areas, such as Xingzhong, sanctioned by the state, and whose privileges hinge on the pure luck bestowed upon them by the state. And also many other types of privileged citizens. So my general view is that I guess it would be good to put the discussion on inequality in this larger context from a historical background, so that we would have probably a more illustrating understanding of the issues relating to inequality in China. I think I will just stop here. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Yu. Teemu, would you like to have, 10 to 15 minutes to respond? You're muted. Okay, great.
Yes, I would be happy to. I mean, these are obviously incredibly rich comments. Thanks to you both. I am deeply grateful for the care with which you've read the paper and listened to me and your thoughts, which are really useful and will help me tremendously as I move forward. I'm not going to try to respond to all of them because I'm also want to make sure I hear from the audience, but just a couple of thoughts. I think I'll start with Professor Lienau first. So I think the global connection is obviously hugely important. And you're absolutely right. I don't really discuss it very much. I mean, there is, in the Maoist period, there's this relates also to I think some of Professor Yu's points. Part of the reason, there's many ways to look at this, the reason for TV's success, and this relates to TV's success. Partly you could say they were successful precisely because, they were so far behind, right? And, there was unharnessed capital, surplus labor just waiting to be utilized. So, anybody could have done something with that. To some extent, that's true. But I think it was very important that Mao Zedong delinked from the world. Because if China had opened up to the West in 1949, it probably would have become another, kind of third world basket case. Instead, it delinked and built its own institutions, educated its citizens, conducted land reform and did all these things. You could say that about urban reforms too, to some extent, some people say, well, China proved that capitalism works. Well, part of the success of capitalism in China in recent years has been subsidized by decades of socialism, where this workforce, if China has a very well-educated, well-disciplined workforce, well, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? So there are these global connections. And interestingly, of course, during the Maoist period, Mao's ideology was to take the class struggle global, right? His version of the three worlds theory was that, there are the superpowers, China after the break with the Soviet Union and the United States are the same. They are the enemies of, the revolutionary third world nations, right? And that's why China supported a lot of these Maoist precisely Maoist movements around the world. So there are these global elements that I don't really get into, and I am tempted to, although I'm trying to keep this a brief history of inequality. The comment about, let me see, I can't really respond to all of them, but I think the point, I'm very interested in general, sort of from a theoretical perspective on these theorizing the corporation, right? And corporate forms, which could be political or economic, they could be anything. In some sense, we're talking about just collective legal forms, right? And I am familiar with David Siepley's work, which is very interesting. At some point when I was writing this paper, I also thought of Dirk Hartog's work on the history of New York, where he basically argues that early on in New York, before the city of New York used basically property law to perform the functions of local government. So you kind of had property law as local government law. So if you look historically, I think you can find a lot of these, especially sort of before the 20th century, a lot of these different combinations and recombinations of the political and economic and the ways in which they work. And so to think going forward, I think part of the problem that I think we're dealing with is with this globalization, convergence, you know, I feel like we have so few models left, and the vocabulary that we have is so impoverished. It's actually very difficult. Its vocabulary is so standardized now and so spare. It's hard. That is part of the reason why it's hard for us to sort of move forward or break out of these categories we created for ourselves. So that's why I'm not sort of sure what exactly my lessons are for going forward. I'm afraid I'm as stuck as everybody else. And it is nice to look back at the TVEs. But I think, yes, on the one hand, you could say, if we go to the question, if there's anything specific to China about the TVE, sure, you could say, you know, when you have an area where there's surplus labor, you know, and underutilized capital, all of these raise bigger questions that I'm not going to get into, anybody could develop it. But I think what's interesting about the TVE is that not only did this enterprise emerge, but it was governed in a relatively egalitarian manner, in a way that benefited the villages generally as a whole, as opposed to somebody just, you know, running the village as a warlord, right, and pocketing, you know, whatever came out of it. Not that there wasn't corruption, but there were clearly some kind of institutions of accountability. So that, I think, is interesting about the Chinese case. We might ask, why didn't this work out in state-owned enterprises? I wanted to be very careful because I didn't want to say state-owned enterprises cannot work. That's not the way I want to be read. But I think part of it, so that if you want to think about the China-specific problems here, I think a big part of the enterprise SOE's problem has to do with the kind of particular bureaucratic structure of the Chinese central state, which is very fragmentary. So there are a lot of overlapping and sort of competing hierarchies. And the state-owned enterprises, this is the too many mothers-in-law problem. So instead of sort of being controlled by one or the other unit, they had these controlling pressures, right, which sort of made it impossible, to the extent that they were not to be romanticized, but to the extent that there were some organic village institutions that had emerged, that political fragmentary, formally enforced competition perhaps made it difficult for that kind of structures to emerge. I would also say, and maybe it's just that this kind of egalitarian economic democracy, maybe it's not infinitely scalable. Some of these TVs were very large, but they were still embedded in fairly local institutions, right? So part of the reason perhaps why they worked is when you're talking about a village or even a township, information travels. And of course, you know, there are competing interests in villages too. Vicious personal rivalries, you know, it's not like it's some kind of harmonious whole. Terrible things go on in villages, right? But information travels, so that partly makes certain types of accountability possible. And in a village level or township level, informal sanctions perhaps also work in a way that they might not work at a higher level. So that's sort of my immediate response to that aspect of those parts of your comments. And then I really appreciate also Professor Yu's drawing attention to the fact that I don't really define inequality. I just take it as a given that, you know, equality means I focus on economic and to a lesser degree political equality, and just take those as a givens. Equality, of course, is not a self-defining term, and I'm not actually, if I just think about it philosophically, I'm not sure what it even means. There's always hierarchies, there's always distinctions, and we probably wouldn't not to have them. The minute you start drawing distinctions, you know, some things matter more, I would argue. So, I mean, even under sort of Western liberalism, by equality, we just means basically political equality. Everybody has the right to vote. But I really like the Buddhist notion, for example. I mean, our notion of equality does not include animals, other living beings, right? So and even within the United States, you know, you talk about the different kinds of citizens, more and less privileged citizens, even in the PRC, you know, and absolutely the chairman Mao, you know, distinguished between class enemies, and, you know, there were sort of different degrees of enemies and different kinds of people were excluded within different degrees among the people. There's only equality for the people, which is a political category, not, you know, a biological category. And so equality for the people and death for everybody else. Of course, even in the United States, we have citizens and we have terrorists, right? You know, we have illegal aliens, you know, sort of the equivalent of migrant labor in China. So this is not, so that's not necessary. Even in our egalitarian society, we have all these distinctions that operate in analogous, albeit distinct different ways. And this is where, I guess, where culture comes in. I completely agree that, you know, there are these three sources, traditions of equality that you raise, you know, the kind of the imperial Confucian tradition, the Marxian tradition, and kind of the reform market era tradition, all of which have different notions of equality or not. And they all feed into this. I mean, there again goes the idea of a brief history of inequality. So I have to find some way to acknowledge some of that history. I do to some extent in terms of my economic analysis when I refer to the kind of clan institutions dating from with a Confucian foundation. But part of the problem, part of the reason why I like this project is because it sort of started out with these two entities, you know, SOEs and TVEs. And it just started spilling out and out and out. And at some point, I sort of have to establish parameters and decide what exactly it is that I want to say. But I think all these, but I do have to address the question of equality head on and say more about it. So maybe I will pause with that because we have about half hour left, and I would like to make sure I get we get some comments from the audience as well. So a huge thank you to you both.
All right, thank you very much. So at this point, I'd like to open up the session to Q&A from the audience. I'm going to ask the first question, just to like take my prerogative as one of the hosts. And so Teemu, like, thank you for this this incredibly interesting talk. And I also read the 2019 article last year when it came out with enormous interest. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask a long question. So just the specific kind of like a relatively technical clarification question. Which is about like basically, you know, like at the core of the article, there's this very interesting claim about the role that, you know, local governmental organizational law plays in the organization of TBEs, and you at various points advance the claim that it kind of like substitutes functionally for the lack of a corporate law. But then that kind of begs the question, so does it substitute fully, right? So this is a little bit complicated by the fact that you later bring in, you know, kinship networks and their self-organization as kind of like a further substitute. And now I get that argument quite clearly, right? Like it's, I think based on your earlier work and a lot of the other literature in the work in the field, Yes, within the kinship network, their own governance rules and their own kind of property rules and so on and so forth can very often functionally substitute for the things that you get out of the company law, shares, asset partitioning protections, and so on and so forth, governance rules and so on. Now the thing is that that's not quite the same thing as saying that local government laws themselves are an adequate substitute. Right? You can say that local government laws plus kinship networks, those two things combined would give you some kind of like a normative regulatory framework that functionally substitutes for the company law. But the local government law itself usually says nothing about allocation of financial assets, who gets to own what shares, as you readily point out in the paper. It's mainly about basically like how the government's run. And yes, of course, with TVEs, how the government is run matters a huge amount to how the TVE is run. But there are steps in between that don't make those things fully kind of like either functionally or regulatorily the same thing, right? Which is presumably where the kinship network steps in and begins to kind of like help you do the transition. I guess which begs the question, right? If that's what the substitution effect really is about, then perhaps the answer for inequality is right there, right? In the absence of company law, local government law can't fully substitute. It has to rely on the existence of like relatively strong kinship networks. But as we all know, kinship networks aren't really that scalable in modern commercialized economy. They're relatively limited in scope and somewhat limited in scale. And that's the major difference between a TVE and either a private firm that later takes advantage of the company law or an SOE that has its own formalized rules and institutions. So I guess the question really is that kind of like an accurate description of the argument? And please, if you have a question, raise your hand and I will call on people afterwards.
Thanks. That's a really good question. And I think I hadn't really focused in quite those terms, so this is very useful. I think in the paper, I advanced the claim that the local government law, village law can function as, and did to some degree function as a kind of corporation law. I think I advanced it both as an analytic claim and as an empirical claim. And I am committed to the analytic proposition that village law can, even if you take aside some of the Confucian kinship aspects. I would then add, and it's an empirical question, when, whether, how, to what degree it actually does function in those terms. But it is certainly consistent with what I want to say, that it would work better where there are underlying kinship connections, thick kinship connections. There's evidence that, for example, TVs have been very successful in areas where there may have been some like, temple-based communities. So to some extent, I think when I'm talking about really village law, local government law, I really am, I think, meaning the set of norms that govern that community. And the thickness and the thicker the social ties, presumably, the more likely those norms are going to work successfully, the more likely TVs are going to be able to operate well and provide public goods, whatever they're supposed to do. So kinship networks could be part of it, could be other things, but I wouldn't want to insist that the kinship networks are the sine qua non, without which, you couldn't have a kind of local government law that functions as a TVE law. So I think that's my kind of immediate response to your extremely useful question. Thank you, appreciate it.
Great, so until somebody has a question, let me just ask a quick follow-up to my question. Which is, so like the way that I can imagine local government laws being self-sufficient in providing kind of like a corporate law would be something of the following, right? Local government laws provide enough of a basis for basically kind of like the self-organization and self-rule of local communities without too much interference from the center and too much reliance on their institutions. And then what happens is local government, basically that law, depending on the region, sometimes it can, provides enough of kind of like a socio-political foundation for interaction within the community that then gives them the ability to kind of like coordinate amongst themselves and issues kind of like a set of governing documents and principles for the TVE, right? So that's a little bit of a different argument than saying the local governments, the laws themselves, can function as a company law. Like essentially, like they're providing the political basis for, I guess, like informal communal rules that functionally provide a sort of like equivalent of the company law. But the reason why I keep pushing on this point is, you know, the core things the company law provides is not just the governance aspect, right? It's more about basically asset allocation and, you know, allocation of shares and dividends and so on and so forth. And those things aren't usually are, as far as I know, very rarely directly provided by local government laws. You can easily see how local government laws can give rise to those things as a matter of local regulation, but it's like there's an extra step, right? And this is again where the Kinship network stuff begins to really help, because the Kinship network stuff, the Kinship networks kind of automatically provide that extra step. But even without them, I suppose you can certainly see the extra step being taken within the context of the local government law.
I see your point. I think it is both. It's both. I think both formal and informal institutions are a crucial part of what I mean by local government law here. The role of the informal institutions, you know, that I don't need to explain that. It's sort of like, you know, provides the kind of informal enforcement, you know, the circulation of information, that, you know, reducing transaction costs, whatnot. But insofar as some of these, and first of all, it is the formal government, it's the government officials that, you know, are in charge of overseeing these TVEs. They are not, but they might be elected or appointed or whatever. You know, these are formally, legally appointed officials, you know, who play that role. So it's not, you know, like just people, you know, deciding on their own for this specific purpose. You know, I would like to, as opposed, I would like a certain person to run my enterprise, even though I don't want to be politically in charge of other things. So that's just a politically provided element. Also, to the extent that it's the TVEs that pioneered selling shares in these enterprises. So of course, you know, the local government issued the shares, they sold them, you know, that's how they harness capital, right? So, which is also what SOEs do on a larger scale. So I think that when it comes to financing these enterprises, the formal part of the government apparatus is just as important, right? So I do think it is the combination of so even though the SOEs have the benefit of the formal structure, I think those structures are vital, but just not, they're necessary but not sufficient, would be sort of my more considered response.
Great, thank you. So I have Ivan, or and then Joyman.
Thank you, Professor Ruskola, for your lecture, and thank you, Professor Zhang and Professor Chen, for organizing such an interesting talk. I have just few comments. I appreciate a lot the philosophical comment of Professor Xingzhong and the idea of the problem of citizenship, like the way the government see the relationship between the individual, the communities, and the property. Like if you look at the Western legal tradition in the history, I mean, the idea of the private property as something absolute is something more than in the history, and or maybe in the Roman time, the idea of a private property based on the will of the person. In the Middle Age, we see something different the idea of the so-called dominium, so a different way of how to see the relationship between the community, the communities, and the land. So the way this idea of property shapes also the subject of the laws, who are not anymore individuals but communities. And still today we see, for example, in the northern part of Italy, something which reminds us, which looks somehow similar to the community, the collective properties in rural China. So the idea of communities where they have their shares, and the shares is based on a particular way of understanding the private property and not the economic contribution or the capital of the shares. Or it's a way to understand the the relationship of the real rights in a different way. And if we see the Western tradition, we see that at a certain point they needed private property more of the times in order to settle also a political order. So somehow the right to vote is also based on the absolute power that a person has on his private property. So somehow the idea of express an independent will because he is a sovereign in his own little property. So the idea of rule of law, the private property, and freedom of express personal will. So the idea how to combine together this political order, political needs, and a different, which is expressed in a different way of understanding basically the real rights and economic benefits somehow. So maybe if we Professor Ruskola, you mentioned also the idea of the possible use in today's or in the modern or in the future. And you mentioned the globalized, this global world and the problem of the lacking of words. And this is so interesting. I always, when I think of the lack of words and concept, I always think of Harold J. Berman, where he says that when we make comparison, somehow we need to develop also a kind of communifying language. So we should not all the time try to translate concept, but also to absorb new words. So from comparison. So maybe one day we should not puzzle ourselves anymore about rule of law, rule by law, rule of man, but just take a figure or a concept and decline it in his own way and make our vocabulary richer. And so in the future, like the possible way, I emphasize this real right, the connection with properties. So in the future, where there is also this non-materialistic property, out there in that environment, we can see also new communities emerging. During the COVID-19, we saw in China this mutual organization and mutual assistance organization just grew up autonomously from the society. So also the idea of these self-ruled communities and that they share something in common, a need or a purpose. So this again remind us a lot about history and the fact that many we already have in the history some categories for this. So I just wanted to share some comments. Yeah.
Liebman, go ahead, and then Tamara.
Yeah, thanks. So my question is in what ways, like Marxism, I don't mean the structure of the Marxist political structure, but Marxism's ideology. To what extent does that help us interpret TVE and SOEs? You mentioned how the labels of reforms are misleading and how the class struggle is won. But I wonder if there's more that we can use the ideology to help us interpret. And also contemporary Marxian critiques. I wonder if that also assists us to tackling the problem. And the second slightly more specific question is, I just wonder, why did the states in the end go for the urban model? Is states capitalism in a Chinese model simply just pure capitalism? Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Tamar, and then Mary, if you would like to also say your question, please.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. So I'm going to take advantage of this talk and ask Professor Ruskola his view on the following two kind of broader questions, which is first, when do you think that substitutes here, local government law, as you call it, exhaust their value in the development process? Is there a point in time, and are we heading there? And the second question is, as we all, I think, know and observe, we see an increasing legalization of political institutions, a little bit close to recent work by Professor Zhang. And my question is, what do you think is the increasing value of law to the economic development process in this recent legalization of political institutions? Is there an added value for the law to the economic development process that the party state cannot achieve through its former policy or other substitutes?
Mary, you have the final question, and then we'll let Teemu answer.
This is Mary Young. My question had to do with how local is local state governance of the TDEs. And the reason I asked is I was interested in the uniformity of application of the local state law, if the laws are similar in all localities, and actually the execution then of it. And how would this affect commercial transactions among localities? I'm not quite certain how broad, how regional, or how quote unquote national or provincial their transactions may be. And would this then differences perhaps in local governance, or at least in the execution or application of understanding of local laws, even if they are uniform across localities, how would that necessarily then allow for customary practices among customary practices? So in a way, you're allowing, for customary practices that perhaps you consider that the informal region of law in TDE governance, either in the governance or in actually transacting business. And so I'm trying to figure out how the local versus provincial versus grand state, the TVE's local state governance as a form of corporate law works.
Great. So Teemu, if you want, please have the last word.
Sure. Thank you all for your questions. I really appreciate them. Whether I can answer them adequately or not, I will take a stab. So the question of I appreciate the comment really about the relation between our notions of subjectivity and different kinds of property. So I think it's important, that in these communities, the TVs, there was a form of collective property, and that was linked with a sort of collective sense of identity. And I think that then goes to the question, what is the role of Marxist ideology in this? I haven't thought of that specifically. I'm sure it is there, but it's not, there's some certain notion of solidarity, unity, obviously, but it's not the people. That's People Inc., whether it's that unity is fictional or real. And this also relates to the question of also how local is local. So even though, yes, there was this sense of community among, various villages, townships, it's very noteworthy. And one of the ways in which often these people would sort of, the TVEs would share kind of their bounty, since they couldn't distribute profits because there were no formal owners. It was a standard practice that a TVE, since their salaries would be higher than in other types of employment or farming, they would try to employ at least one person in each household in a TVE. However, to the extent that they grew and needed more labor, let's say migrant labor from other townships, from other villages, those employees would get paid much less. They wouldn't get the same wage. So the community clearly had limits. This is not the people of Marx, right? It's a more local people. But I'm sure that sense, whatever that sense of collectivity, egalitarianism is also inflected, as Professor Yu also suggested, through these multiple histories of both Confucianism and socialism. In terms of legalization and what is the value of law to, or necessity of law to economic development, well, I think it is absolutely vital, if only because today, of course, China's, and this goes to our earlier discussion also, China's development is so deeply connected to global economic development, global capital, right? And you can't harness that capital without law, right? The majority of enterprises, that are listed on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, whatever, are corporatized state SOEs, right? So at least at a certain level, the law is absolutely vital to economic development in the form in which it is happening today. And I would say then, to sort of return to the question of how much uniformity, if we stay at the local level, let's say township and villages for now, how uniform was that local government law? Formally, quite uniform. There are legally required village elections. You have to have village officials and so on and so forth. Huge variation across regions in practice, even, to what extent or in what way, how well those even formally required elections are conducted. And so even on that level, but more importantly, again, just like I said earlier, even with SOEs, you need to have the formal law. The formal law is not enough. You need to have the kind of customary practices. Same thing on the village level. So even though the formal law is quite uniform, the customary practices without question vary across region. And there is a lot of regional variation in terms of, which regions had the most TVEs, were most successful. It is no accident that perhaps the greatest concentration, although not the only concentration of successful TVs, was on the southeast coast, which also has a history of lineage organization. So all these things are interlinked. But I think part of the essence of local government law is that in the end, it is local, right? So I wouldn't want to. So again, I'm making the point, which I think is important analytically, that local government law can function as a kind of corporation law. There's no necessary incompatibility. To what extent, whether, where, and how that actually happens then is an empirical, historical, political question. So maybe I'll pause with that and thank all of you for your questions and participation, all the participants for hopefully staying awake.